Tonight, we're going to talk about a girl. We don't know her name. Her story was never written down. But we know this much. She was found alone in a stone room above a bakery in Florence. The mirror beside her was cracked. Her skin, blistered, peeling, raw. The smell of vinegar, egg, and lead hung in the air. She had tried to make herself beautiful, but instead, she burned her face. This isn't a legend. It's a tragedy. One of many, because during the Middle Ages, beauty was not soft. It was not kind. It was not safe. It was dangerous, deadly, and demanded everything. Let me ask you this. What would you risk just to be seen as worthy? In a time when a woman's future could depend on her skin, her cheeks, the whiteness of her forehead, some were willing to risk everything, even their lives. Because in the 14th and 15th centuries, to be a noblewoman, or even a merchant's daughter, was to live in a prison made of silk, rules, and glass. You were judged the moment you entered a room. Pale skin meant wealth. Soft hands meant virtue. A single blemish could cost you a marriage. And marriage? It wasn't love. It was survival. So women, and sometimes men, turned to recipes, strange recipes, crushed pearl powder, vinegar washes, bathe your face in mercury for a glow, rub lime and ash to scrub away the dark, whiten the skin with lead paste. The deadlier, the better. And if it hurt, that was the cost. That girl, the one in Florence, she wasn't unique. She was one of hundreds. A quiet casualty of a society that said, "You are only as valuable as you are beautiful." So, what was beauty in the medieval world? Where did these standards come from? Who enforced them? And who suffered most from them? Stay with me. Because this isn't a story about vanity. It's a story about power, desperation, and the quiet violence hidden behind powdered skin. Where are you watching from tonight? And be honest. Would you have followed these rituals if your entire life depended on it? What did it mean to be beautiful in the Middle Ages? Forget what you know about modern standards. This wasn't about curves or smiles or even youth. This was about status. And it all started with skin. Because in medieval Europe, the paler your skin, the higher your value. Why? Because pale meant privilege. It meant you didn't labor in the fields. It meant you stayed indoors, behind walls, behind veils, behind protection. Pale skin told the world you were rich, sheltered, untouched by sweat, sun, or survival. A tan? That was for peasants. Blemishes? Proof of sin. Rosy cheeks? Acceptable, but only if artificially applied. And so began the war against the human body. In France, Italy, and England, noble women powdered their faces with white lead and vinegar to bleach away imperfections. The result? A ghostly mask of purity and a slow poisoning of the blood. In Germany, some women used mercury compounds to eliminate freckles. They didn't know it would inflame their eyes, damage their lungs, and rot their teeth. But the goal wasn't health. It was control. Control over a body that society had already claimed as currency. Ask yourself, if your face determined whether your family ate this winter, would you risk disfigurement for it? Because that's what many were forced to do. A noble daughter wasn't just a child. She was an asset. Her beauty was her dowry. Her appearance could forge alliances, bring land, settle debts. A single pockmark, from disease, acne, or sun, could sabotage everything. And don't forget, mirrors were rare. Most women never saw their reflection clearly. They trusted rumors, advice, powders, and shadowy candlelight. Imagine altering your face daily, without ever truly knowing how you looked. And yet, it wasn't just about skin. Eyebrows were plucked thin or removed completely. Hairlines were shaved back to create the illusion of a high, noble forehead. Some even used hot irons to scorch the skin above the eyes, stopping hair growth permanently. Yes, you heard that right. They burned their foreheads to look elegant. A smooth, dome-like brow was seen as divine, untouched by nature. A high forehead meant intelligence, piety, and compliance. It wasn't just beauty, it was branding. Let me ask again, is this beauty or a form of obedience? Even the church, for all its warnings against vanity, quietly enforced the same ideals. Saints were painted with alabaster skin. The Virgin Mary, the model of all women, was pale, perfect, and expressionless. To be godly, you had to be beautiful. To be beautiful, you had to suffer. So when you imagine the Middle Ages, don't just picture armored knights or plague masks. Picture a girl, maybe 16, standing in a cold stone room. She has a knife for plucking, powder for bleaching, a comb dipped in vinegar, a prayer whispered under her breath, not for her soul, but for her skin. Imagine standing before a small wooden table. On it, a bowl of crushed white powder, a cloth soaked in vinegar, a shard of broken mirror, and a tiny jar labeled simply Venetian ceruse. This is your makeup, and it's killing you. Ceruse was the most prized cosmetic of the medieval and Renaissance world. A mixture of white lead and vinegar, aged in clay pots, then filtered and dried. It clung to the skin like marble. It erased freckles, redness, and humanity. It made noble women glow like statues, but it also ate them from the inside. Lead seeped into the blood. It weakened muscles, blurred vision, inflamed gums, and led to stillbirths. Some women lost their hair, others lost their minds. And yet, they kept using it because beauty was survival. The medieval noblewoman was expected to be more than attractive. She was expected to be impossibly so, ethereal, delicate, angelic, a walking symbol of status and spiritual purity. So she reached for more. Lye, a caustic alkaline made from ash, was used to lighten hands, arms, and sometimes even wash the face. But it burned. If not diluted properly, it blistered the skin. Left too long, it could leave permanent scars. Still, it was sold in markets. Still, apothecaries made it by the jar. Still, noblewomen used it, because rough hands were a sign of labor, and labor meant shame. Then came the poisons. Arsenic was used in powders to smooth skin, mercury to erase spots and clear heat from the blood. Quicklime, yes, the same substance used to dispose of corpses, was applied to remove hair. The results were often horrifying. Swollen eyes, missing eyebrows, discolored jaws, even death. Why? Why would entire generations of women risk this? Because they had no choice. Their beauty was tied to marriage. Marriage was tied to dowries, land, and legacy. In many cases, a woman who failed to marry was cast aside, locked in a convent, sent to servitude, or left to survive alone in a world that gave her no tools to do so. What would you do if society told you that your only worth was your appearance, and then handed you the very things that would destroy it? This wasn't makeup. This was a ritual of self-destruction, performed daily, under pressure, and in silence. Even men played a role. Husbands bought these powders. Mothers taught their daughters to mix them. Kings and poets praised the pale-faced ideal, the angelic woman with skin whiter than milk, softer than velvet. But they never saw the sores, the peeling lips, the teeth falling out, the sleepless nights. And even when these effects became obvious, they were often explained away. "Oh, she is ill," they'd say. She fasts in devotion. She prays all day. No one said, "She is being poisoned by the standards you gave her." Can you see the trap? The more a woman tried to fit the mold, the more damage she did. And the more damage she did, the more makeup she needed to cover it. A cruel loop, a hidden death spiral, wrapped in velvet, painted in lead. Let me ask you this. What modern standards might future historians see the same way? What will they say we burned, just to be seen? If you think beauty in the Middle Ages was merely fashion, you're mistaken. It wasn't just about the court or the castle. It was about the soul. Or at least, that's what they told you. The church had its own version of beauty, and it was far more dangerous. In a world governed by scripture, sermons, and saints, the church dictated more than morality. It defined ideals. The Virgin Mary wasn't just the mother of Christ. She was the template for womanhood. What did she look like in paintings? Smooth, pale skin, soft features, a face free of blemish or age, passive, silent, still. Every young girl in Europe grew up staring at this image. So what happened when she looked in a mirror and saw acne, or a sunburn, or the dark circles of hunger? She prayed, she wept, and then she reached for the powder. Ask yourself, how do you confess a sin when the world tells you your face is the sin? Church leaders condemned vanity. They preached against cosmetics, perfumes, and painted faces. But in the same breath, they told women that the body was a reflection of the soul, that clean skin meant spiritual purity, that beauty was divine. The contradiction was cruel. To wear makeup was to risk damnation. But to be unattractive, to be seen as imperfect, was to be viewed with suspicion. A woman who looked too plain? Surely she had something to hide. A woman with a blemish? Maybe it was punishment for secret sins. Some priests even claimed that physical flaws were marks of inner corruption. And in this twisted theology, beauty became a battleground. Women prayed for good skin. They confessed the act of applying rouge, only to apply it again the next morning. They lit candles to saints for clarity while mixing lead into their lotions. And in convents, where cosmetics were forbidden, women still found ways. Ashes used as eyeliner, rose water to cleanse the cheeks, crushed pearls to lighten scars. Because purity wasn't just spiritual, it was visible, and visibility was survival. Let's pause here. Can you see the pressure? To be holy, but not proud. To be beautiful, but not vain. To be seen, but not too much. It was a trap, a prison built from silence and painted walls. And yet, within those walls, women whispered, shared recipes, warned each other, sometimes helped each other cover the scars, literal and metaphorical, left by this impossible world. We often think of medieval women as passive, submissive, powerless. But don't mistake restraint for weakness. They resisted in quiet ways. Some painted their faces in secret. Some used natural herbs instead of poisons. Some refused altogether and paid the price in whispers, rumors, or exclusion. And some, rare but real, fought back. They wrote texts, letters, poems. They mocked the beauty standards of their time. They saw the virgin ideal and dared to ask, why must our bodies suffer to reflect our souls? But the church never answered. It simply rang its bells, lit its candles, and painted another saint, alabaster and untouched, on the cathedral wall. Let's step behind the curtain, not into the battlefield or the market, but into the bedchamber of a noblewoman in the 14th century. The room is dim, cold, stone walls dressed in old tapestries, a single window barred and shuttered. A brazier glows faintly in the corner. The air smells of damp fabric and something sharper, vinegar and powdered lead. It's morning, but her face must be prepared long before the sun sees it. She rises before the servants bring warm water. She wraps herself in furs, not for luxury, but because the draft is relentless. There's no fireplace in her chamber, only discipline. Now the ritual begins. First, the skin must be scraped, not with razors, but with linen cloth, rubbed raw to slough off oil and blemishes. If there's swelling, a poultice of egg whites and crushed rose petals. If the skin is too dark, out comes the ceruse, mixed with a dash of ground pearl, if the budget allows. She paints her face carefully. The goal isn't to look painted, it's to look unreal, pale, silent, almost holy, no color, no emotion. Expression itself is considered vulgar. Imagine the pressure to erase not only your flaws, but your very self. She shaves her forehead next. Yes, shaves. With a small blade dipped in olive oil to prevent cuts. The goal is to raise the hairline, to show a long, intelligent brow. And if hair returns, she may singe the roots with a heated rod, burn them until they never grow again. Some women apply lye to the eyebrows, dissolving them completely, because brows are wild, uncontrolled, animal. A noble woman must be above nature. Her lips remain bare. Color is for harlots. Only peasants and prostitutes stain their mouths red. If anything, she'll dab a little crushed chalk for a dry, subdued look. Then come the hands. Soft skin, no calluses. They're soaked in vinegar or milk, sometimes rubbed with mashed bread or goose fat. Because these hands must not look like they've worked, even if they have. And the hair, oh, the hair. It must be long, but hidden, braided tight, pinned under a silk veil or horned headdress. Only a husband should see it loose. This isn't fashion. This is ritual. This is how a woman proves she is not wild, not poor, not sinful, not ordinary. Let's pause. What happens to a girl who doesn't follow this routine? What if she's too dark-skinned from sun exposure? What if she has freckles, or a crooked nose, or even a visible scar? She's considered less marriageable, less valuable. She might be sent to a nunnery, married to a much older man, or worse, left dependent on her family for life. A burden. In noble circles, beauty was power. But unlike men, women could not earn it through battle or coin. They had to perform it, every morning, every hour. And even if they succeeded, time would still take it. Every wrinkle was a countdown, every blemish, a betrayal, every pregnancy, a risk to both life and beauty. And yet, she smiled, at court, at meals, in portraits, even as the powders flaked, even as her gums bled from the mercury in her lotion. Why? Because she had no other option. To be beautiful was to be safe. To be safe was to be invisible behind perfection. This is not the fairy tale we've been sold. This is not courtly love or damsels in towers. This is a body sacrificed to expectation. By now, you might be wondering, if beauty was so painful, so dangerous, why did it matter so much? Because in the medieval world, beauty was power, and for women, often denied land, titles, or voice, it was one of the only currencies they had. Let's begin in the court, not in the throne room, but just beside it, in the shadows, behind silk curtains, where queens whispered, and mistresses walked the line between luxury and scandal. Consider Isabella of France, Queen of England, known by some as the she-wolf. But before the betrayal, before the rebellion, there was her face. Chroniclers described her as radiant, more beautiful than any woman in the realm. But beauty wasn't decoration, it was her shield. As the wife of Edward II, a king consumed by favorites and politics, Isabella used her appearance strategically, every hair in place, her gowns precise. She played the role of pious queen, gentle mother, until the moment came to strike. And when it did, she led an invasion, deposed her husband, placed her son on the throne. Ask yourself, would the court have followed her if she hadn't looked the part? If her skin had scarred, if her elegance had faltered, would history remember her the same? Beauty, in that moment, wasn't just art, it was warfare. Now consider Agnes Sorel, mistress to Charles VII of France. She didn't wear veils. She wore silk so sheer you could see her navel. She bleached her hair into a golden halo. She powdered her face until it glowed like alabaster. And Charles, broken from war, haunted by madness, adored her. Agnes became more than a lover. She advised on state matters. She influenced appointments. She controlled access to the king. Other nobles hated her. Priests condemned her. But she held power they could neither understand nor defeat. Until she died. Suddenly, at 28. Some say it was dysentery. Others whisper poison, jealousy, politics, the usual. Again, a question. Was it her beauty that elevated her, or her beauty that killed her? Because beauty in court was never neutral. It was always a threat. Too plain and you're ignored. Too bold and you're accused. Too perfect and you're dangerous. In some cases, women who simply appeared too beautiful were branded witches. Think about that. Skin that glowed too much, eyes too bright, hair too full. Clearly, it couldn't be natural. Clearly, it must be magic. Clearly, she must burn. This paranoia ran deep. Even noble women who followed every rule, who powdered, bled, scrubbed, and prayed, still risked everything if they were noticed too much. That was the trap. To be desirable, but not seductive. To be admired, but not envied. To be present, but not remembered. It was a balancing act no one could win. And the cost? It wasn't just time. It wasn't just pain. It was often life itself. Lead poisoning from ceruse, mercury from skin treatments, even early forms of Botox, derived from deadly nightshade, caused hallucinations, paralysis, death. But they kept using them, because a single wrinkle could cost you a marriage. A freckle could cost you inheritance. A fading face could end your influence, or worse, make you replaceable. And there was always someone younger, always someone paler, always someone willing to suffer a little more. So the queens powdered on, the mistresses risked scandal. The ladies in waiting watched, learned, and followed. This wasn't vanity. This was survival in silk. Not every woman in medieval Europe lived in a palace. Not every tragedy wore a crown. Some lived in townhouses, narrow streets. Above the shop their husbands owned. The spice trader, the candle maker, the furrier. They weren't peasants, but they weren't nobility either. They were merchants. And for their wives, beauty came with a different cost. Let's meet one. She wakes before dawn, the street still silent. She prays quickly, not out of devotion, but habit. Today, her husband expects her to walk with him to market, a show of wealth, civility, and so she prepares. She cannot afford imported silks, but she knows how to fake it. She bleaches her linen with lye until it glows ghostly white, stitches pearls, false ones, into her veil. Her shoes have pointed toes longer than is practical. But that's the point. To walk uncomfortably is to prove you don't have to work. Her face? She powders it with a chalk and vinegar paste. It cakes at the edges of her nose. She doesn't mind. She applies rouge to her cheeks, sparingly, Not the bold red of a brothel, but the healthy pink of someone who eats well. She darkens her lashes with soot and oils her lips not for shine, but for moisture. Cracked lips suggest poverty, illness, neglect. Ask yourself, why does she do this? Is it vanity? Or is it because every woman at the guild feast will be watching? One wrinkle, one frayed cuff, and the whispers begin. She's slipping. Her husband's not selling enough. Did you hear they missed church last week? In the merchant class, reputation was everything, and reputation lived in appearance. A well-dressed wife meant strong finances. A pale face meant she didn't labor. A jeweled girdle meant respectability. Even fertility was judged visually. Hips wide enough, skin glowing enough, hair thick enough. There were rules, and breaking them had consequences. If her neighbors thought she was dressing above her station, she might be called before the sumptuary court. Yes, in many cities there were actual laws about what you could wear based on your class. Too much lace, and she could be fined. Too rich a color, and her family's honor questioned. But if she dressed too simply, she'd be seen as falling, or worse, insulting her husband's position. This was a tightrope, and it was walked every day. The irony? Her husband didn't notice. Not the powder, not the rouge, not the hours she spent making herself acceptable to his peers. To him, she simply looked like a proper wife. But to her, every morning was a campaign, every outfit a message, every wrinkle a risk. So let's ask something deeper. How free is a woman who cannot afford to look poor? She's not shackled in chains. She's not imprisoned in a tower. But her body, her face, her voice, all are curated, watched, judged. Because in her world, one mistake doesn't just embarrass her. It embarrasses the family name. And should her husband fall ill, or lose a shipment, or gamble too much, she'll be the first sign that something is wrong. Her faded gown, her thinning veil, they'll betray her. Then the invitations stop, the greetings turn cold, and the gossip begins again, only now sharper. They'll say she's aged, that she was never truly beautiful, that her grace was all makeup and mirrors. And just like that, she disappears from the inner circle. Not because she changed, but because she could no longer afford to pretend. They called it Venetian ceruse, a thick, creamy white paint made from vinegar and white lead. It promised purity, radiance, nobility, but it didn't come with a warning label, and it killed slowly. Let's step back for a moment. We often imagine medieval cosmetics as primitive. A bit of rose water here, some herbal balm there. But the truth is far more disturbing. The elite, desperate to look eternally youthful, smeared their skin with toxins. Not occasionally, daily, for years. Ceruse wasn't just common, it was fashionable, used in England, France, Italy, across the courts of Europe, favored by aristocrats, copied by the ambitious. And yes, it worked, temporarily. The lead created a luminous white finish that hid blemishes, scars, even smallpox pitting. Under candlelight, it made the skin glow. But beneath the surface, it was eating them alive. Lead absorbed through the skin, and even worse, through cracked or damaged areas, slowly poisoned the blood. It caused hair loss, bleeding gums, muscle weakness, mental decline, and eventually organ failure. And yet they kept using it. Because what was the alternative? To let the world see their true face? To appear tired, aged, mortal? Ask yourself, if your worth, your security, your very place in the world depended on your face, would you have stopped? Would you have wiped the poison away? or layered it on more carefully. The women didn't just use ceruse, they applied belladonna, beautiful lady, an extract of deadly nightshade that dilated the pupils and gave their eyes a glassy, seductive look. But belladonna is neurotoxic. It caused blurred vision, dizziness, hallucinations, in some cases blindness. They used mercury to cure skin infections. It did, temporarily, but it also led to tremors, madness, and death. They bathed in arsenic solutions to soften their skin. They drank tinctures made with turpentine for breath sweetening. They used burnt almonds and lead sulfide to darken their brows. These weren't rare cases. These were trends, shared, whispered, passed between ladies like secret spells. And when someone died, when a noblewoman collapsed from convulsions, or wasted away coughing blood, or lost her mind entirely, they blamed the fever. They blamed a curse. They never blamed the rouge. It was easier that way. And yet, doesn't this all sound familiar? Think about now. The creams, the surgeries, the injections, the treatments promising youth, radiance, flawless skin. Are we really so far from them? Because medieval women weren't fools. They weren't vain caricatures painting their faces for fun. They were women trying to survive in a world where beauty was dangerous to lack and dangerous to pursue. Some recognized the risks. A 14th century physician warned, "No lady should wear white lead on her skin, for it will cause the face to wither and the mind to fail." But that voice was drowned out by the next trend, the next recipe, the next noblewoman who looked perfect and paid the price for it silently. Because the damage didn't always show up in youth. It crept in with time. First the fatigue, then the tremors, then the unexplainable swelling, or bleeding, or madness. And still they reached for the jar. Still they dabbed on the rouge. Still they smiled at the mirror, never knowing it would be their last audience. Because to be beautiful was to be seen. To be seen was to be desired. And to be desired was the only way to exist in their world. She sits on a velvet throne. Her skin glows white, smooth, porcelain. Her hair is perfectly coiled. Her dress cascades like water. In her hand, a single rose. In her eyes, nothing. The portrait doesn't show the tremor in her fingers. It doesn't show the open sores beneath her powdered chin, or the bleeding gums behind that closed, obedient smile. This is what history remembers, painted lies. But behind every royal portrait was a very real body, aging, aching, and quietly decaying. Let's take Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, a master of image, power, and political theater. In her youth, Elizabeth was admired for her wit and boldness, but her appearance too was a tool. She had long copper-red hair, a high forehead, pale skin, the ideal of Tudor beauty. But then came smallpox. In 1562, she survived it, barely, but the illness left deep scarring on her face. For a queen whose authority rested partly on divine appearance, that was a catastrophe. From that moment on, Elizabeth became obsessed with controlling how she looked. She ordered her maids to apply thick layers of Venetian ceruse to mask the scars. Her hair thinned, so she wore elaborate wigs. Her teeth blackened, so she rarely opened her mouth when she smiled. Yet in every royal portrait, she looked ageless, flawless, almost inhuman, because that's what the court expected. That's what the people demanded. And behind that mask, Elizabeth was in pain. She suffered headaches, toothaches, mood swings, all signs of lead poisoning. Her temper worsened with age. Her skin grew thinner. Her memory began to fray. But no one could question her beauty because no one saw her real face. Ask yourself, how much pain would you endure to maintain an illusion others depend on? How many women do this still? Now, Elizabeth was not alone. Across Europe, queens and noblewomen lived under the same regime of performance. Isabella of Valois was praised for her youthful looks, until court rumors mocked her for aging too quickly. Catherine de' Medici, known for her intelligence and cruelty, still maintained a strict cosmetic routine well into her 60s. Anne of Denmark was depicted as the picture of elegance, even as she privately battled chronic illness and depression. The painter's brush erased the truth. Wrinkles softened, jowls tightened, sores vanished. Even death was beautified. Portraits of deceased queens were often painted after death, with pale, glowing skin, relaxed expressions, eternal youth. Reality didn't matter. What mattered was memory, and memory had to be beautiful. But ask yourself again, how many women were painted into perfection just before they collapsed? You see, royalty didn't just use cosmetics to be admired. They used them to project stability. A queen who looked sick, weak, human, that invited whispers. And whispers could become rebellions. Even the church played along. Beauty was framed as divine, purity visible. To be pale and calm was to be chosen by God. To show age, scars, fatigue was to invite suspicion. And so they painted over the pain, layered lie upon lie, until even they forgot what lay underneath. We look at those portraits now in museums, in books, in documentaries. We praise their elegance, their power, their fashion. But how many of those women, queens, duchesses, ladies of the court, were silently dying beneath the very paints that made them immortal? We will never know, but we can guess. The more perfect the face, the more carefully it was probably hiding something. They said she was beautiful, not in the way peasants whispered about tavern girls, not in the way poets praised with ink and wine, but in the way that made noblemen risk disgrace. That made kings stare too long. She wore beauty like a weapon. But that weapon had a price. This was the court of Marguerite of Navarre, the 16th century French queen, poet, political broker, patron of artists, and a woman raised in a world where romance and rot were tightly braided. At court, love was not a fluttering thing. It was strategy, a game. And in that game, beauty was currency. But beauty required sacrifice. And that sacrifice often began with the skin. We've spoken of white lead and ceruse. But now, let's look deeper, not just at appearance, but desire. In the courts of France, Italy, and England, women were expected to appear fragile, ethereal, almost sickly, pale skin, thin waists, glossy eyes, trembling hands. Not strength, delicacy. A woman on the edge of fainting was considered divine, and so they chased that look, even if it meant starving, even if it meant drinking vinegar to dull their appetite, even if it meant lacing corsets until ribs cracked and lungs collapsed. Can you imagine tightening your breath until your vision dimmed, just to be noticed? Some women blackened their teeth deliberately, believing it made their smiles seem more mysterious. Others drank concoctions made with chalk, alum, or burnt nutshells to clear the skin from within. These remedies caused nausea, ulcers, even infertility. But it didn't matter, because if you didn't catch a husband, if you didn't hold a husband, you were nothing. And for the noblewoman, a bad marriage wasn't just lonely. It could be fatal. Mistresses at court knew this well. To remain desirable was to remain protected. To grow old, to sag, to wrinkle to fade, meant dismissal, exile, sometimes worse. Some women, desperate to keep a lover's gaze, turned to aphrodisiacs, or what they thought were aphrodisiacs. A mix of saffron, cinnamon, powdered beetle shells, honey, and sometimes arsenic. They dabbed it behind their ears, on their lips, beneath the tongue. They called it love potion, but it was slow poison. Other women used belladonna to keep their eyes wide and shimmering. But over time, the drug ate at their sight, leaving some half-blind by 40. And the worst part? Even when they knew it was hurting them, they didn't stop. Let me ask you, if you were loved only when you suffered, would you stop suffering? Would you accept the wrinkles, the softening flesh, the sagging eyes, if it meant being ignored, being forgotten? Or would you take another sip from the vial, another pinch of powder, another layer of paint? We like to think the past was crueler than the present, but the difference is often just visibility. In medieval and early modern Europe, pain was ritualized, dressed up as fashion, bound in silk, hidden beneath rouge. The noblewoman who collapsed at court was said to be delicate, not dying. The duchess who wasted away in bed, coughing and pale, was called melancholic, not poisoned. And the queen whose skin peeled from lead ceruse, she was still praised as a goddess, even as she lost her mind. Beauty in the medieval world wasn't just a standard, it was a performance, one that demanded sacrifice, daily, quietly, fatally. And courtship? It wasn't about love, it was about survival. The mirror lied to her every morning. It told her she was radiant, unchanging, eternal. It whispered that her skin glowed with youth, that her beauty had not faded, and she believed it because she had to. For women of the medieval and Renaissance elite, the mirror wasn't just a piece of polished glass. It was a battlefield, and it didn't reflect truth. It reflected hope. But mirrors cannot warn you when the poison takes hold. In 1582, Maria of Bavaria, a duchess in the Holy Roman Empire, was found collapsed in her chambers. Her skin was peeling. Her lips were blistered. She was delirious with fever. Physicians blamed bad humors, but her maid knew the truth. Maria had begun using a new Venetian cosmetic, praised in the courts of Italy. A cream promised to erase freckles, smooth wrinkles, brighten the skin. It was sold in perfume shops and whispered about in salons. Its secret ingredient? Mercury. Mercury, quicksilver, was believed to drive away blemishes and draw out impurities. It did that, and more. It also seeped into the bloodstream, poisoning the brain, weakening the heart, and eventually causing madness. Maria wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. All across Europe, noble women died slowly in front of their mirrors. And the tragedy? They looked more beautiful with every passing day. Their skin turned pale, their eyes glossy, their features blurred into porcelain masks. They looked angelic, right until they stopped breathing. Ask yourself, what do you do when the thing that makes you admired is also the thing killing you? Do you stop, or do you put on another layer, hoping for just one more day of admiration? Many didn't stop. They were praised for their beauty as they wasted away. Poets immortalized them. Artists painted their portraits posthumously. Skin smooth, cheeks faintly pink, eyes closed in peace. But their real deaths were anything but peaceful. Convulsions, hallucinations, bleeding gums, screams in the night, all hidden, all silenced. Because to admit the truth, that vanity had become fatal, was to unravel the illusion that held the entire court together. And it wasn't just Mercury. Verdigris, a green pigment used for eyeshadow, was made from copper acetate. It burned when applied, causing ulcers and blindness over time. Belladonna dilated pupils, but damaged vision permanently. Lead cerusse caused tremors, fatigue, and early-onset dementia. But the more a woman suffered, the more she was praised for her elegance. It wasn't seen as death. It was seen as devotion to beauty, to love, to her role. Even the church turned away. Confessors rarely questioned cosmetic practices. They warned of vanity as a sin, but not of the toxins. They spoke of spiritual decay, not chemical, and so the ritual continued. A woman would sit at her dressing table. A servant would apply the creams, powder the face, rouge the cheeks, each stroke a step closer to decay, each dab another nail in the coffin. Here's the brutal irony. These women died because they loved beauty, but beauty never loved them back. The mirror, once a symbol of control, became a silent executioner. It showed them what they wanted, never what they were becoming. And yet, they kept looking. Because in a world where a woman's value was her face, turning away from the mirror meant turning away from survival. They came with promises, silken robes, silver tongues, and little glass bottles that sparkled like magic. They called themselves apothecaries, cosmeticians, doctors of beauty. But most were merchants of death. They walked through marketplaces and noble courts alike, offering salvation to the aging, the scarred, the forgotten. Their claims? Miraculous. Erase 20 years overnight. Turn olive skin to ivory. Make him fall in love again. And desperate women believed them. In 14th century Venice, you could walk into a perfumery off the Rialto Bridge and find a dozen remedies. White powders, rose creams, golden elixirs. None labeled with ingredients. None regulated. All incredibly expensive. And what were they made of? Crushed pearls, ox gall, arsenic, burnt almonds, dead wasps, lead. Yes, lead again. It was ground into a fine powder, mixed with vinegar, rosewater, or animal fats, and sold under names like Venetian dew, lily paste, or alabaster veil. They told women it would seal in youth, but in truth, it sealed their fate. Here's the question we often forget to ask. Who profited from this pain? Who got rich while women withered? Apothecaries did. Men who knew better. Men who saw the sores, the rashes, the deaths, and sold more anyway. In 1487, an English merchant named Robert Farrington was arrested in London for selling a skin rejuvenation tonic to noblewomen. 3 died. 1 lost all her hair. He fled, disappeared. But someone else took his place. They always did. And the irony? The worse the symptoms, the more women returned. They were told it was the impurities leaving the body. That burning meant the cream was working. That peeling skin was just the old self dying. They were taught to suffer gratefully. Even queens were not spared. Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua, widely considered the most beautiful woman of the Italian Renaissance, used a secret mixture called Bianca, a lead-based whitening agent. Her letters mention itching, fever, and cloudy thoughts. But she continued, because stopping meant aging, and aging meant irrelevance. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Because as you sit in your world, safe from these poisons, know this, the women who used them weren't stupid. They weren't vain in the way we like to mock. They were trapped by expectation, by marriage contracts, by social power structures, and by the merchants who weaponized all of it for profit. These so-called beauty experts were often men who never used their own products. They simply sold them and watched. Watched as women came back week after week, begging for more. Watched as their hands trembled, as their teeth darkened, as their skin yellowed, cracked, and failed. And then they watched them die. No punishment came. No laws were passed. Because in the medieval world, beauty was a woman's responsibility and her burden alone. And death? That was just the cost. The market didn't stop. The lies didn't stop. The demand didn't stop. Even centuries later, echoes of this horror remain. She lay still on the wooden table. Her gown was rolled down to the waist. Her wrists trembled. A candle flickered behind her, casting shadows over the basin of iron tools. The barber surgeon leaned in. "This will bring the blood to your cheeks again," he whispered. She nodded. She didn't believe him. But what other choice did she have? In the medieval world, beauty wasn't only in the hands of nature, it was in the hands of surgeons. And these weren't the surgeons we imagine today. They were often barbers, butchers, and battlefield assistants. They stitched wounds and pulled teeth. But for the wealthy, they also offered something more: aesthetic enhancement, bloodletting, scar draining, vein puncturing, procedures meant to cleanse the body and restore radiance. But here's the question. What does it say about a society when its beauty standards draw actual blood? For noble women, pale skin wasn't just fashionable. It was a symbol. It meant you were above the fields, above labor. It meant purity, delicacy, nobility. But how did one achieve it? Through controlled bleeding. Barber surgeons would open a vein, usually in the arm or foot, to remove excess heat or black bile, believed to cause redness or blotching. It was done before weddings, before festivals, before a suitor arrived. Sometimes they bled the face itself, tiny incisions near the jaw or nose, to cool the complexion. It hurt, it bruised, it caused infections. And yet, women paid well for it. In France, records from 1326 show noble women scheduling weekly bloodlettings as part of their beauty regimen. Not for health, for appearance. And if the bleeding didn't work, there were other options. Leeches were applied under the eyes to reduce puffiness. Hot glass cupping was used on the cheeks to stimulate glow. Needle piercing was done to tighten sagging skin, a primitive, painful form of skin lifting. Did it work? Number. But results didn't matter. The attempt was what counted, because to be seen trying to remain beautiful was in itself admirable. The court whispered cruelly about aging women who let themselves go, but it praised those who bled, fainted, and limped in the name of grace. Have you ever heard of someone suffering for the look and not for themselves? That began here. These women weren't seeking comfort. They weren't seeking truth. They were seeking acceptance from husbands, kings, priests, poets. And acceptance came with a price. One English noblewoman, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was said to have lost over 2 liters of blood across a single month. Not from injury, but from beauty maintenance. She died shortly after. The surgeon faced no consequences, because again, no one asked, why was this necessary? They only asked, was she lovely in the coffin? In many cases, the women who endured these procedures looked worse, not better. Scars formed, infections spread. But they were told it was working. They were told beauty required the purge. And the worst part? They believed it, because their value was taught to them in inches of waistline, in pallor of skin, in silence, not in survival. Beauty became a war zone, and the surgeon was its priest. Beauty was never free, but for the poor, it was dangerous in a different way. You see, among nobles, beauty was expected, even demanded. Among peasants, it was feared. A peasant girl who stood out, who had golden hair, smooth skin, or bright eyes, did not receive praise. She received suspicion, whispers, blame. Why? Because in medieval villages, beauty had consequences. A girl too pretty could be accused of stealing attention, tempting men, or worse, using witchcraft. In 1371, in the village of Wicken Fen in Cambridgeshire, a miller's daughter named Alice Thorne was said to have eyes like wet violets and skin paler than milk. She was 17. She had no dowry, no marriage prospects, but all the men noticed her. When a married man began visiting her family's grain shed too often, it didn't take long. The whispers came. She bewitched him. She must be a temptress. She used herbs in her mouth to curse his desire. Alice was dragged before the village priest. No evidence, just talk. They shaved her head. They examined her body for witches' marks. None were found, but she was beaten anyway, and exiled. For what? Being beautiful in the wrong place. So let me ask you, how much are you willing to change just to feel safe? That question haunted thousands of young women in medieval Europe. Some would smear mud and soot on their faces before leaving home. Others would cut their hair short or walk hunched, hiding their figure. They weren't trying to escape danger. They were trying to escape attention. Because attention for a poor girl was a curse. If the local lord noticed her, she could be taken. If the reeve took interest, her father might sell her for protection. And if a nobleman became obsessed, there was no escape. In Bohemia, a 15th century folktale tells of Marzina, a shepherd girl so beautiful that the lord of the estate took her as his concubine. When she grew pregnant, he cast her out, claiming she had cursed him. She wandered into the woods and died of fever. The villagers said it was her own fault for drawing too much attention. But was it? Is it still her fault when silence is survival? The tragedy was that peasant girls were often blamed for their misfortune. If they were attacked, they were asking for it. If they were desired, they were dangerous. This fear of beauty wasn't just social, it became legal. In 1428, the Bishop of Trier issued a decree warning priests to guard their eyes against village women of unnatural allure. A backhanded way of blaming peasant girls for distracting clergy. And by the 15th century, several German towns had recorded beauty fines, penalties levied on women accused of using charm or sensuality for gain. These weren't courtesans. These were widows, maidens, mothers, trying to survive. To be poor and beautiful in medieval Europe was to live on a knife's edge. Loved one day, blamed the next, punished forever. So many learned to hide, to shrink themselves, to be plain, to be invisible. Because sometimes invisibility was the only safety left. In a palace of silver mirrors and perfumed corridors, the queen sits alone. Her maids have been dismissed. The door is locked, and on the table before her lies a small ivory jar, sealed tight, its contents lethal. She dips her fingers inside. A pale paste, smooth and cold. She spreads it across her face like a shroud, covering blemishes, dullness, wrinkles. It burns, but she doesn't flinch. Because to be a queen in medieval Europe was to be more than a ruler. It was to be an object of scrutiny, of worship, of perfection. But what did it cost to look perfect? The answer? Lead. Yes, the very metal that poisoned wells and crippled workers was the most prized ingredient in royal cosmetics. From the 14th to the 17th century, noblewomen across Europe, queens included, used ceruse, a white lead-based foundation, to achieve a pale, divine complexion. Imported from Venice or crafted by alchemists, it was expensive, rare, and deadly. In England, Queen Elizabeth I was its most famous victim. Her portraits show flawless porcelain skin. But the truth beneath was very different. By the 1580s, Elizabeth had already suffered smallpox, which left pockmarks across her face. Ceruse became her mask, a royal shield. She wore it every day, in thick, painted layers. It covered her shame, and slowly, it killed her. Lead seeps into the skin. It causes hair loss, tooth decay, memory loss, insomnia, and paralysis. Elizabeth experienced all of these. By the time she reached her 60s, she had no teeth. Her hair had fallen out, yet she continued to apply the poison. Because if she let the world see her decline, her power might follow. Isn't it strange? The most powerful woman in Europe, enslaved by a jar of powder, and she wasn't alone. In France, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria used mercury-based lip color to stain her lips red, even as her gums turned black. In Portugal, Queen Eleanor of Viseu used vinegar and powdered bone to bleach her face, causing chronic infections. All of them suffered, but none dared stop. Because in the world of royalty, youth was survival. A queen who aged too visibly could be discarded, replaced, or worse, challenged. Her beauty was her image was her myth, and her myth kept armies loyal. So they burned, they bled, they peeled their skin and swallowed tinctures of arsenic. They wore masks of death to remain queens in life. Have you ever worn something, makeup, clothing, a smile, that didn't feel like you just to keep others comfortable? Now imagine doing that for decades, with the fate of a nation watching. Elizabeth's doctors begged her to stop, but she refused. In her final days, she wouldn't let anyone remove her makeup, even as it crusted and cracked. She died pale as marble, just the way she wanted to be remembered. But beneath that pale mask was a face ruined by the very thing meant to preserve it. That is the irony at the heart of medieval beauty among the elite. The more they chased youth, the faster it fled. Open a 15th century beauty manual, and you won't find kindness. You'll find fire, acid, blood, bones, lead. Beauty in the medieval world wasn't about self-expression. It was about transformation, at any cost. It was alchemy, both in theory and practice. But unlike gold, the skin couldn't survive the philosopher's stone. Would you believe that medieval women boiled pigeons just to lighten their faces? It's true. Recipe from 1459, Bruges. Take the brain of a dove, mix with rose water and alum. Let it sit beneath the moon for 3 nights, then apply to the cheeks. The alum bleached, the rose water soothed, and the dove's brain? That was sympathetic magic, the belief that the purity of a creature could be absorbed. But there were darker instructions. For clearer eyes, crushed pearls soaked in vinegar. To shrink wrinkles, rub the skin with mercury and egg whites. To remove freckles, bathe in the urine of a red-haired boy. Yes, urine. It was prized for its acidity and warmth. Still want medieval skincare? One recipe from Florence advised women to burn the shells of snails, mix with powdered glass, and apply the paste beneath the eyes. It was meant to reduce puffiness. It often blinded them. These weren't rumors. They were written by monks, physicians, and apothecaries, respected men. Their books were copied, translated, revered. Women followed them not because they were foolish, but because there was nothing else. In a society where your entire fate, marriage, social standing, safety, depended on your appearance, why wouldn't you risk it all? You had no career to build, no property to own, no voice in court, but you had a face, and a single blemish could destroy your future. So, you mixed arsenic with honey. You slept with meat poultices tied to your cheeks. You painted over sores with layers of lead. You whispered prayers over boiling concoctions. And you hoped. Imagine this. You're 17. Your father has arranged a match. You are told he likes fair skin. You look in the mirror and see a sunspot. What do? In Venice, you'd buy a bottle of aqua tofana, a notorious elixir said to enhance complexion. It was also a poison. Some claim it killed more women than it ever helped. In London, you'd visit an apothecary's apprentice and pay extra for night creams. They worked, until the rash set in. So many of these beauty secrets were passed down from woman to woman, scrawled on scraps of parchment, or whispered by candlelight. They weren't beauty rituals, they were sacrifices. Some historians argue that these dangerous recipes were acts of resistance, women using the only tools available to seize control of their fate. Maybe that's true, but many more argue they were victims of a cruel system that placed worth over wellness, appearance over health, and obedience over life. So ask yourself, how far would you go to feel seen, to be wanted, to survive? Because in the medieval world, every face was a battlefield, and every beauty recipe was a gamble with death. In the flickering gloom of a medieval cathedral, stained glass paints a holy light. On the walls, saints stare down, chaste, pale, expressionless. And from the pulpit, a priest preaches not just salvation, but shame. Vanity is the gateway to hell, he thunders, and painted flesh leads to damnation. This was not just metaphor, it was doctrine, because in the eyes of the medieval church, a woman's face wasn't hers. It belonged to God or her husband. To alter it was to lie. To make it beautiful was to tempt. What happens when your survival depends on looking good, but your soul depends on looking plain? That was the impossible bind medieval women lived inside. Priests condemned makeup as devil's paint. They called beauty the bait of Satan. Even mirrors were viewed with suspicion, traps of the ego. A 13th century bishop once wrote, "The woman who whitens her face with lead or colors her lips like blood walks in league with the whore of Babylon." Not poetry, accusation. And yet, these same clergy praise the Virgin Mary for her radiant complexion. They canonized saints for their glowing skin. They compared holiness to beauty, and then blamed women for chasing it. How could you win? You were told to be desirable, but not too much. To be clean, but not proud. To look good, but never admit you tried. The church weaponized contradiction, and it punished the women who failed to walk the line. Ever heard of Saint Wilgefortis? She was a young noblewoman in Portugal, promised in marriage against her will. She prayed to God for deliverance, and legend says she grew a beard overnight. Her beauty gone, the match was broken. But instead of rejoicing, her father crucified her. Yes, she was nailed to a cross for not being beautiful enough. She became a martyr. Her image spread across Europe. A woman saint with a beard, symbolizing both freedom from vanity and punishment for resisting beauty's power. The lesson? You are damned if you're too beautiful, and damned if you're not. The church didn't just punish women through sermons, it shaped laws. In England and France, Women could be excommunicated for using false beautifying. In Florence, a 14th century edict banned women from wearing makeup in church. In Germany, confession manuals instructed priests to interrogate women about the cosmetics they used, and how often. And yet, behind closed doors, nuns in convents used rose oil and alum powder to smooth their skin. Confessors ignored noblewomen's light face whitening if their families were rich enough. Hypocrisy, cloaked in incense. Have we truly escaped that world? Even today, don't we still hear echoes of that judgment? Too much makeup. She's fake. Natural is better, but only if you're naturally flawless. The medieval church planted those seeds centuries ago, and they've never fully died. So imagine you're a young woman in 1387. You walk into church with your cheeks powdered, your lips slightly red. The priest glares. Old women whisper, men stare, and your soul, it hangs in the balance. Do you stop painting your face, or do you keep doing it, hoping to secure a better marriage, a safer future? That was the tragedy. You had to choose between survival and salvation, because the church didn't just condemn beauty, it condemned female agency. To control your face was to control your fate. And for many medieval women, that was the most unforgivable sin. Let's step into a royal court. The year is 1350. The air smells of sweat, wax, and crushed violets. The nobles are gathering, not for war, but for politics. And politics, in this world, are negotiated through marriage, skin, and silence. A beautiful woman here is more than admired. She is dangerous. Because beauty isn't just decoration, it's currency. Ever wonder how a 16-year-old girl could influence kings? Her face. In courts from Paris to Prague, beauty was leveraged like gold. A pale, blemish-free woman could gain land, alliances, even armies, all without lifting a sword. But it came at a price. Take Agnes Sorel, mistress to Charles VII of France. She didn't just wear pearls, she wore lead white on her face daily. Why? Because in the dim candlelight of court, pale skin meant youth, fertility, and divine favor. She became a fashion icon. And soon, other noble women followed, burning their faces to mimic her ghost-like complexion. But Agnes died young, at 28. Many historians believe it was from mercury poisoning, a slow, elegant suicide in the name of beauty. Or consider Isabella of France, known as the she-wolf of France. She was clever, ruthless, and meticulous in her appearance. She powdered her hands with bone ash. She soaked her skin in vinegar and milk to maintain softness. She used her beauty to gain influence, even during her rebellion against her husband, King Edward II. This wasn't vanity, it was warfare. Because for many medieval women, their face was the only weapon they could legally wield. Ask yourself, if you had no right to vote, no right to inherit land, no right to command soldiers, but you had a mirror, what would you do? Beauty wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Queens and courtesans alike built empires with their skin. They knew the risks, the burns, the poison, the judgment. But they knew something else too, that in a world ruled by men, looking the part of perfection gave them a sliver of control. And yet, that same weapon could be turned against them. Let's talk about Empress Matilda, granddaughter of William the Conqueror. She had royal blood, sharp intelligence, and ambition. But chroniclers attacked her appearance. They said she was too proud, too masculine, painted like a harlot. In truth, she dared to lead an army, so they disfigured her in words. History punished beauty when it was used too boldly. Women who played the game too well were called witches. Or worse, they disappeared from the records entirely. How many brilliant, powerful women were reduced to a line? She was fair of face before being erased. It's not just about beauty, it's about power. And power, when held by women, always frightened the world. So yes, medieval women painted their faces, not because they were vain, but because they were fighting. Every brush of white lead, every tint of red dye was a declaration. I exist. I matter. I will not go unnoticed. And for many of them, that was the only power they'd ever hold. Picture a small village square, late autumn. The leaves are gone. The sky is bruised. A woman stands alone in the middle of the crowd. Her face is swollen, not from violence, but from a reaction to a homemade cosmetic. She used crushed berries, alum, and white chalk, trying to emulate the nobility. Instead, her skin blistered. Now the priest calls her a witch. This wasn't rare. In late medieval Europe, beauty that went wrong was often seen as evidence of sin. And sin? Sin had to be punished. Why did society fear a woman who looked too good or not good enough? Let's step back. By the 15th century, there was a growing obsession with purity and danger, especially around women's bodies. The church, the law, and public opinion had become tightly braided, and beauty stood at the center of the noose. A woman accused of false beautifying could face more than ridicule. She could be tried. In some German towns, local courts prosecuted women who wore devilish paint or tried to seduce honest men with unnatural charms. One record from Cologne, dated 1473, tells of a widow arrested for changing her skin to deceive God's design. She wasn't executed, but she was flogged and then forced to wear a sign. I lied with my face. Yes, that happened. Public humiliation was the weapon of choice. A woman could be forced to stand barefoot in church, confessing her sin of vanity. Some were shaved bald. Others were made to scrub the steps of the altar with bare hands, all while the village watched. Can you imagine being punished not for hurting someone, but for simply trying to survive through beauty? But it didn't end in villages. Even queens weren't safe. Queen Joan of Navarre, stepmother to Henry V of England, was accused of witchcraft in 1419. Historians now believe the real reason? She was aging and still trying to maintain her looks with creams and herbs. They said she conjured spirits to hold her youth. She was imprisoned for years, her wealth seized, her image tarnished forever. Then there were the sumptuary laws, laws that governed what people could wear or how they could appear. Often aimed at keeping the lower classes in their place, these laws also policed female adornment. In Venice, a woman who wore rouge without a noble title could be fined or whipped. In Florence, the color red was banned for all but a few elite women. The wrong shade on your lips could cost you your freedom. Beauty became a battlefield, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. Power, rebellion, autonomy. Can you sense how fear of women's independence was painted over with moral panic? If a woman used herbs, she was a healer. If she used herbs and looked beautiful, suddenly she was a witch. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. And when control cracked, punishment followed. One 15th century French text warned, "The painted woman brings plague upon the house. Her children will rot, her husband will stray, her soul will burn." That fear, that moral rot, was projected onto any woman who dared to alter her face. The deeper truth, the world didn't want women to be powerful, and beauty was power. So when it couldn't be bought it was attacked. When it couldn't be controlled, it was criminalized. That's the brutal irony. What began as a desperate attempt to survive, to be noticed, to be married, to be safe, became a reason for public execution in some corners of Europe by the end of the Middle Ages. And all of it began with a mirror. Look closely at a modern compact mirror. The shimmer, the blush, the powdered glow. Now squint. Beneath that polished glass lies a long, violent history. A history built on lead, mercury, vinegar, chalk, crushed beetles, bruised women, and the silent scream of centuries of burned faces. What we call beauty today, flawless skin, rosy cheeks, the perfect complexion, didn't appear from nowhere. It was forged in pain, and that pain has a memory. Have you ever wondered why pale skin remained the beauty standard for so long, even in cultures where most people didn't look that way? The answer isn't fashion, it's fear. In medieval Europe, pale skin meant two things. You didn't work, and you were protected. You were rich enough to stay indoors, far from the sun, far from labor, far from disease. It wasn't about attractiveness, it was about status. It was about not dying. So peasants rubbed chalk on their cheeks. Ladies boiled lily roots. Queens painted themselves with white lead. It didn't matter that it hurt. It didn't matter that it scarred. They weren't chasing beauty. They were chasing survival. But that standard didn't stay locked in the Middle Ages. When colonial powers expanded into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they carried these toxic ideals with them. European colonizers brought with them not just gunpowder and steel, but mirrors and beauty propaganda. They told brown women their skin was dirty. They told African royalty they'd look more civilized if they lightened their tone. They told Asian nobility to refine their looks with imported French powders. Do you see it now? The burns, the bleaching, the blood. It never stopped. It only evolved. By the 1700s, white lead had become standard across European society. In England, women used Venetian ceruse, a lead-based mixture endorsed by none other than Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, wore so much of it that her face cracked with every smile. Her portraits were touched up, her mirrors blurred. She died with sores beneath the paint. Even then, no one questioned the price. In the 19th century, arsenic pills were sold to clear the skin. In the early 20th century, American ads marketed radioactive face creams to glow with youth. And today, skin-lightening products are a multi-billion-dollar industry, most sold in former colonies, many still containing harmful chemicals banned in the West. Isn't it strange how we call it self-care now? But the echoes are loud, aren't they? Medieval women scorch their cheeks with wine and salt. Modern women inject acid under their skin. Different tools, same desperation. Because the message hasn't changed. Be softer, be smoother, be paler, be younger, be beautiful, or be invisible. And still, we rarely ask the question, who does this standard serve? Who profits from your pain? Throughout history, the same people have always won, the powerful, the ones who set the rules but never bleed for them, and the ones who lose, often women, often poor, often forgotten. But their stories matter, because every time a girl today flinches in the mirror, every time a woman apologizes for aging, every time someone bleaches their skin because they were told their natural color wasn't professional enough, they are carrying the silent weight of centuries of shame. That's the legacy. A tragedy that began with ash and blood in a medieval courtyard. They say it began with a face, Helen of Troy. the face that launched 1,000 ships. But have you ever stopped to ask, why was a woman's face blamed for a war? Why not the kings, the greed, the politics? Because even in myth, beauty becomes the scapegoat. Helen was never real, at least not in the way legends claim. But her story shaped the way women were seen for centuries, especially in the medieval mind. To be beautiful, the church warned, was to be dangerous. To be desired was to be cursed. To wield beauty was to wield a weapon. So ask yourself, if a woman's face could be blamed for war, what else could be blamed on her skin, her lips, her scent? The Middle Ages didn't forget Helen. They twisted her into sermons, painted her in church murals, and used her as a cautionary tale. In 12th century England, monks wrote poems blaming her for the fall of kingdoms. In 14th century France, priests warned that a woman's painted face is the devil's invitation. They weren't just talking about myth. They were talking about the living women in their villages, the ones who dared to wear rouge, who dared to look different. And so began the era of beauty as betrayal. A woman who used herbs to smooth her skin might be labeled an enchantress. One who perfumed her body could be accused of seducing married men. And one who healed others with oils, she risked the pyre. Let's be clear, this wasn't about makeup, it was about control. Because if you can convince people that beauty is dangerous, you can punish women for having it, or for trying to create it. Have you ever noticed how society praises beauty, but never the woman who owns it? In medieval courts, beauty was praised only when it served the powerful. A noble woman's appearance was a reflection of her husband's wealth. A maiden's pale skin symbolized her family's purity, not her own. But the moment she took that beauty into her own hands, it became rebellion. That's why they burned herbs and banned mirrors. That's why they outlawed lip stains and hair dyes for commoners. That's why women who dared to alter themselves were branded as vain, sinful, or worse, witches. Helen's myth made it easy, because if a face can cause war, it can also justify punishment. It can excuse shame. It can silence a woman's voice, even before she speaks. But here's the twist. Even as society feared beauty, it fed on it. Royal painters blurred flaws. Writers praised milk and rose skin. Knights composed odes to their lovers' golden hair, though much of that hair was dyed with saffron and lye. It was a trap. Be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Be desired, but not desiring. Be seen, but not too clearly. This contradiction broke women in silence. They plucked their hairlines to mimic nobility. They rubbed mercury on their cheeks to keep skin pale. They burned themselves, not in protest, but in compliance. Because if the world expected you to glow, you learned to burn quietly. So the next time someone says, beauty is harmless, ask them, harmless to whom? To the woman whose face becomes myth? To the one punished for being too plain or too proud? To the girl whose skin is still compared to porcelain, centuries after lead killed her ancestors? Helen never asked to be legend, but history made her one. And the women who followed? They were real. Their pain, not poetry, not myth, just forgotten. The mirror in a medieval household was not made of silvered glass. It was polished metal, bronze, sometimes tin. It reflected dimly like a pool of dirty water. And yet, even in that dull shimmer, girls saw enough to begin hating themselves. Have you ever looked into a mirror and judged what looked back? Now imagine doing that in the 1300s with the church watching over your shoulder. The medieval world was not kind to girls. They were not daughters. They were future wives, chattel, diplomatic tokens. Their value was measured not in character, not in wisdom, but in purity and complexion. And if the skin wasn't white enough, if the hair wasn't light enough, if the nose curved the wrong way, they were flawed, damaged, less worthy of marriage, less worthy of life. One 14-year-old girl in the 14th century in Tuscany scrubbed her face with vinegar and ashes until her skin split. She believed God would love her more if she looked like the Virgin Mary. That girl died of infection 2 weeks later. Her name wasn't recorded. No poems were written. No mourning bells rung. She became one of thousands, lost to a culture that taught girls their worth was skin deep. But they weren't just judged by men. They were judged by each other, by mothers, by older women who had internalized the same cruelty and passed it down like a curse. Keep your hands soft. Don't go into the sun. Rub this onto your cheeks. It will make you look more noble. It always started young. A girl of 7 in Burgundy was taught to pluck the fine hairs from her temples to widen her forehead. A girl of 9 in London was rubbed with crushed pearls and honey to lighten her face. A girl of 11 in Paris wept because her mother told her she'd never marry with such muddy eyes. Where are you watching from? Does this still happen in your part of the world? Do little girls still learn to erase themselves? Because the echoes are loud. Medieval girls whispered the same fears we hear today. Am I ugly? Will anyone love me? Is this what I'm supposed to look like? But in their time, there were no helplines, no videos, no communities offering comfort or truth. There was the Bible, there were the men, there were the mirrors, and there was the silence. In elite circles, young girls were sent to convents not for spiritual training, but for grooming. They learned posture, etiquette, how to paint their faces without being caught. They were prepared like livestock for royal auctions, and many never made it past puberty. Because the powders were poisoned, the routines were brutal, the pressure unbearable. Imagine being 12 and knowing, if you do not look perfect by 15, your family might starve. Your siblings might not marry. Your father might fall into debt. So you burn, you bleach, you beg, not for beauty, but for security. How much of this have we truly outgrown? Do our modern mirrors still whisper the same medieval lies? Because the tragedy isn't that girls were taught to chase beauty. It's that they were told beauty was their only escape, their only weapon, their only worth. And when they bled for it, no one looked away. No one stopped it. Because it was tradition. It was normal. It was expected. But we are not required to keep these ghosts alive. We can remember them. We can honor them. And still choose a better story. You might think the queens were safe. Silks on their shoulders, jewels in their crowns, servants at their feet. Surely they didn't suffer the way peasant girls did. But let's set aside the fairy tale, because if beauty was a weapon, then royal women were its most tragic casualties. Think about it. If a peasant girl was expected to look good for her village, what about a queen, whose face represented an entire kingdom? She wasn't just a woman, she was a symbol. Her features had to embody piety, power, and purity, all at once. Her body was the battlefield for dynastic politics, male ego, and religious scrutiny. Take Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. She was called the she-wolf by later chroniclers, painted as a villain. But early in life, she was praised for her angelic face, pale, delicate, untouched by sun. What they didn't write about was the powdered lead she used daily to achieve that look. Isabella's court physician noted her skin grew faint with each winter. Today, we'd recognize the signs of lead poisoning: fatigue, weight loss, tremors, confusion. But back then, it was just the cost of beauty, the cost of being a queen. Or look to Agnes Sorel, mistress to Charles VII of France. She was beloved and hated for her luminous skin and daring gowns. But historians now believe she died young from mercury toxicity, likely from the very skin creams she used to remain desirable. How many royal women were killed slowly, not by politics or poison, but by the beauty standards they were required to uphold? We'll never know, because when a queen died, they didn't autopsy the makeup. They blamed spirits, or childbirth, or stress. They didn't ask what the rouge was made of. They didn't check the charcoal or the crushed shells or the salves. Why? Because to question that would mean questioning the entire system, the court, the advisors, the merchants who sold it all. And that was unthinkable. Even Elizabeth of York, mother to Henry VIII, was recorded as desperately pale in her last years. She used crushed alabaster and vinegar to maintain a porcelain complexion, a look that was literally eating her skin alive. They didn't call it suffering, they called it nobility, because queens were expected to endure quietly, to decorate the throne, not shake it. But here's a question for you. If queens, with all their power, couldn't escape this trap, what hope did any woman have? It wasn't just about looking beautiful. It was about maintaining the illusion, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Because pain, when endured silently, was seen as graceful. And silence? That was the first rule of being royal. No one wanted to know the queen bled. No one wanted to see her sores, or her rotting teeth from sugar paste, or her swollen joints from arsenic creams. They wanted the painting, the portrait, the ideal, and queens gave it to them, even as they died by inches. So next time you see a medieval portrait, ask yourself, what did she go through to look like that? Was that smile painted over pain? Were those rosy cheeks drawn to hide a rash? Was her youth preserved by poison? Here we remember. History rarely mourns the women who bled quietly. They weren't generals. They weren't saints. They weren't even scandalous enough to make it into legend. They were beauty martyrs, sacrificed not by sword or war, but by creams, powders, and expectations. And perhaps the worst part? They volunteered for it. Not because they were vain, but because they were cornered. To survive in noble society, a woman had to be admired. To be admired, she had to be beautiful. To be beautiful, she had to suffer. Let's talk about elecampane, a root boiled and rubbed into the skin to remove freckles, a process so caustic it often left scarring. Or pigeon droppings mixed with vinegar and ash, smeared on the face to lighten skin, recommended by apothecaries as late as the 15th century. Or the infamous ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, sold to noblewomen across Europe, from France to the Low Countries, as Venetian white. It gave the skin a smooth, glowing texture. It also caused nerve damage, ulcerated gums, stillbirths, madness. One noblewoman in Rouen was described in her maid's diary as half lost in the mind, yet whiter than alabaster. She died within a year. No one wrote her name. How many women died nameless, faceless, sacrificed to a standard they never created? Even the church helped fuel the madness. Monks wrote about beauty as a sign of divine favor. Confessors warned women that ugliness was linked to sin, and painters, oh, the painters, They captured only the ideal: soft jaws, porcelain cheeks, hair like corn silk or polished ink. They erased warts, spots, moles, anything too human. And women, in turn, erased themselves. Their personalities dulled, their voices softened, their desires buried beneath layers of powder and lace. Do you feel the echo in our world today? Because it hasn't disappeared. It's just gotten better packaging. Today, it's filters, injections, surgeries. Back then, it was arsenic and vinegar. But the voice whispering, "You are not enough," has always been the same. And the cost? Still brutal. One German noblewoman in 1482 wrote a letter to her sister describing how she no longer felt anything when she smiled. Not emotionally, literally. The skin on her face had become stiff, hardened by years of lead paste. She signed it, "With love from your sister, the mask." We have the letter. We don't have her name. Why do these names keep disappearing? Is it easier to erase them than to face what we've done, what we've inherited? Because these women weren't vain fools. They were survivors in a system that weaponized beauty. They were mothers, daughters, poets, readers. But all we remember is that they were pretty. And if they weren't, they vanished. So now, centuries later, let's say what no one said to them. You didn't deserve this. Not the pain, not the pressure, not the silence. You were more than your skin. And if anyone had listened to your suffering, maybe some of you would have lived longer than your last reflection. Let's stop pretending this was an accident. The suffering of women, the burned faces, the poisoned skin, the lifelong disfigurement from trying to meet impossible beauty standards. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It was engineered by men, for men, and upheld by a society that never asked what it cost her. Ask yourself this: who decided what beauty was in medieval Europe? Did women vote on it? Did they choose the rules? Number, they inherited them. From scholars, from priests, from painters, from kings. It was men who defined pale skin as a sign of nobility. Men who praised small lips, faint brows, and delicate fingers. The kind of beauty that could never survive fieldwork or freedom. Beauty, in this world, was a cage. And the tighter the bars, the more refined the woman seemed. Take the writings of Albertus Magnus, a 13th century cleric and philosopher. He wrote entire treatises on female beauty. He praised unblemished, milk-colored skin and graceful movement, but warned that too much laughter or strong speech ruined a woman's charm. He was a theologian, not a lover, and yet his words shaped how women were seen and how they saw themselves. Then there's Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, a spiritual cornerstone of medieval Europe. In it, Aquinas argued that while beauty was not inherently sinful, women must avoid provoking lust. In other words, a woman must be beautiful, but not too beautiful, seen, but not desired, perfect, but never powerful. How do you survive when the line keeps moving, and every step is a trap? The answer? You don't. Not completely. Even queens were judged by male ambassadors on whether their cheeks glowed like ivory or if their foreheads were clean of shadow. These reports weren't just gossip. They influenced marriages, alliances, war. A pimple could mean the difference between peace and conflict, and women knew it, so they obeyed. They smeared on lead. They painted veins onto their hands to look more noble. They plucked hairline and eyebrows until their faces bled. Not because they were weak, but because the entire system told them their value was their appearance. And that appearance had to please him, the king, the court, the confessor, the painter, the poet. What kind of world tells a girl, if you suffer beautifully, you will be loved? A world designed for her pain to be silent and profitable. Let's not forget the cosmetic merchants. Almost all of them were men. They peddled deadly concoctions and called them elixirs. They wrapped poison in velvet and sold it in churches and market stalls. They knew what it did. They sold it anyway. And if a woman died, another would take her place. There were always more girls, more faces to burn, more profits to make. And those profits fed courts, guilds, taxes. The pain of women built kingdoms. Do you still believe this was vanity? Because if you do, you've missed the story entirely. This was not about self-obsession. It was about compliance, about fear, about living in a world where the wrong look could destroy your future. So, yes, men made the rules, and women paid the price, every single time. But they weren't passive. Even in their pain, they resisted. They wrote letters. They whispered warnings. They tried home remedies, natural pastes, foreign oils. They experimented, not for beauty, but for survival. Because deep down, they knew. If they didn't play the game, they'd be erased. And if they played it too well, they might die anyway. Picture this: a noblewoman seated in a cold stone chamber. Candles flicker. A servant holds a polished sheet of metal, her only mirror. She leans in. What does she see? Not herself, not really. She sees what she's supposed to be. The high forehead, plucked. The pale skin, powdered. The lips, rubbed with crushed berries, trembling from too many applications of vinegar. But the eyes are tired. Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen a stranger? That's what medieval beauty did. It turned women into performers, playing a part written by others. And behind every noble mask, there was a woman asking quietly, "Will this be enough? Enough to be accepted, enough to be married, enough to be left alone?" Because in this world, beauty wasn't pleasure, it was protection. If you were beautiful enough, perhaps your husband wouldn't take another mistress. Perhaps the local priest would treat you with respect. Perhaps the court wouldn't whisper when you passed, but that perhaps came with a cost. Think about this. Why were so many beauty rituals done alone, in silence? Because they were painful, because they were shameful, because they were dangerous. No woman wanted to be caught applying nightshade ointment, or bleaching her hair with goat urine and quicklime, or rubbing her cheeks raw with rough cloth soaked in wine to simulate a natural flush. These weren't just beauty tricks. They were acts of desperation, and desperation is always done behind closed doors. What would she say if she could speak honestly? What if, just once, she looked in that mirror and told the truth? "I am afraid. I am tired of pretending. I want to be seen, but not judged, loved, but not used." But she couldn't say it, because mirrors didn't reflect souls in the Middle Ages. They reflected obedience, and every crack in that image was punished, sometimes socially, sometimes physically. A noblewoman who appeared unkempt or imperfect risked being cast aside. No inheritance, no marriage, no protection. So she made herself smaller, quieter, whiter, and when the mirror lied, she didn't correct it. Have we really changed? Today, our mirrors glow. They speak back. We scroll instead of sit. We filter instead of powder. But the question behind the glass is still the same. Am I enough? And the silence that follows? It's ancient. It stretches back to that chamber, to that flickering candle, to that woman staring at herself through tears she can't afford to cry. Because if the powder runs, if the mask slips, they'll see the truth, And the truth? She was never weak. She was just trying to survive. Let's talk about wealth, not in silver or land, but in skin. In the medieval world, beauty was currency. It could buy a marriage, secure a dowry, elevate a family's status. But like all currencies, the rich hoarded it, and the poor, they paid in different ways. Ask yourself, what happens when beauty becomes a class system? Because that's exactly what it became. In theory, every woman wanted to be beautiful, but in practice, only the rich could afford the tools to get there. White lead paste imported from Venice, ground pearl powders from the Levant, mercury-based eye drops to brighten the gaze, exotic oils from North Africa, dyed veils to soften harsh light on the skin. These were luxury items. Deadly, yes, but expensive. The kind of poison only a lady could purchase. And this was no accident. Wealth bought not just the means, but the right to be beautiful. A peasant woman wearing cosmetics? She'd be mocked. A merchant's wife using too much powder? Suspect. But a duchess? Praised for her noble glow. Can you see the trap? The higher you rose in status, the more beauty was demanded of you. But only wealth could help you meet those demands. Poor women, laborers, washerwomen, midwives, didn't have the time or means. Their skin was burned by the sun. Their hands were calloused. Their nails cracked from work. And that became proof. Proof that they were lesser. Not just in wealth, but in worth. Even the church got involved. Preachers in cathedrals warned against vanity, but their sermons always found exceptions. For queens, for mistresses of noblemen, for the women who tithed generously. It wasn't about sin, it was about access. Do you see how deep this goes? Medieval beauty wasn't just about appearances, it was about power, and power doesn't share. The poor were taught to idolize the noble lady, her delicate shoes, her powdered skin, her jeweled hairnets. But they could never imitate her. If they tried, they were accused of pride, witchcraft, deceit, sometimes worse. There are court records of poor women punished simply for wearing too much rouge, as if red cheeks were a threat. And maybe they were, because beauty, when worn by the poor, becomes rebellion. It says, "I am more than my station. I am more than what you told me I'm allowed to be." That kind of beauty was dangerous, so it was stamped out. Where are you watching from? Do you live in a place where beauty still signals wealth? Because let's be honest, that hasn't changed. From skincare ads to luxury influencers, we're still selling the same dream. Buy this, and you'll be worth something. But in the Middle Ages, that message came wrapped in silk and scripture. And for women who couldn't afford the lie, there was only one truth. You weren't born to be beautiful. You were born to serve someone who was. She's 14, maybe 13, standing still while 3 men talk over her, not to her. One is her father, one is a merchant, one is a priest, and her face is the reason they're here. Because in the medieval world, a girl's face wasn't just her own. It was a bargaining chip, a silent currency traded in the name of alliance, profit, and family survival. Imagine being told your worth rests on the symmetry of your features. In aristocratic circles, the marriage contract was a weapon disguised as tradition. Dowries mattered, yes. Land mattered. Bloodline mattered. But none of it worked without one thing, a presentable bride. And what did presentable mean? Pale skin, no scars, no birthmarks. Those were bad omens. Good teeth, a sign of fertility and health. Thin hands, soft neck, high forehead, a face easy to look at across a long, silent dinner table. That face could change the future of a house. So the pressure started early. Some girls were wrapped in linen headbands as infants to shape the skull. Others were kept out of the sun entirely, confined to cold rooms so they'd never tan or freckle. Their diets were watched, their posture corrected, their laughter, if too loud, was punished. Because no one wants a loud bride, just a pretty one. Can you imagine growing up like that? Your reflection isn't your own. It belongs to your father's ambition, your mother's fears, the local baron's expectations. And when a suitor finally arrives, he inspects the girl like she's cattle. Her dowry's been negotiated, her lineage verified. Now he just needs to see if her face holds up. If it does, he nods. If it doesn't, he walks. No questions, no apologies. Because her value, her entire future, has been reduced to first impressions. Have you ever been judged before you even spoke? That was every noble girl's reality. She wasn't taught to speak. She was taught to be seen and liked. And when she married, that face became her only shield. If her husband grew bored or angry or violent, beauty might protect her for a while. But it was a fragile armor. One illness, one scar, one bad birth, and she'd fall. Some were cast out, some locked away, some replaced. And still, young girls stared into polished silver mirrors, wondering, will I be beautiful enough to survive? It wasn't vanity, it was strategy. There is a silence that follows accident in the medieval world. A fireplace flare, a boiling pot, a careless spill of oil or lye. And suddenly, a girl's future turns to ash. Her cheek blisters, her brow splits, her lips blacken, and something else changes too. Not just the skin, how people look at her, or rather, how they don't. Because in medieval Europe, a disfigured woman was no longer a woman. She became something else, a creature of pity, a cautionary tale, an object to be pitied at best, feared at worst. What happens when beauty is your only armor, and you lose it? This was the quiet horror of so many women, rich or poor. To lose the face you were raised to polish, to be stripped of the very thing that gave you value in your world. And there were countless ways it happened. A misused cosmetic could eat through flesh. Mercury treatments for blemishes could cause ulcers. Even lead-based whitening agents, applied daily, could erode the skin permanently. But there were also less glamorous reasons. A kitchen fire, a jealous rival, a punishment ordered by a lord. Yes, disfigurement was sometimes inflicted. If a woman was accused of adultery, theft, or even just impertinence, a slashed face wasn't uncommon. It was symbolic. You have dishonored your role. Now we dishonor your face. It was a public mark, permanent exile from desirability. Some went into convents after, some hid in shadow, some disappeared entirely. Can you imagine living in a world where a scar could destroy your entire identity? It wasn't just about looks. It was about status, safety, survival. In noble houses, a disfigured daughter was considered damaged goods. Some were never married off. Others were wed in haste to aging widowers or exiled knights, as a quiet way to dispose of shame. And if the woman was already married, she might be discarded, cast into a countryside manor, left without servants, forgotten, because a broken face was a broken promise. The vow of beauty, made silently between girlhood and society, had been shattered. Is this still true today? What happens to women who no longer meet the standard? Do we stop seeing them? Or worse, do we pretend they never mattered? In the medieval world, there was no redemption arc, no heartfelt comeback story. Once your beauty was gone, so was your voice. And yet, even in that silence, some women endured. Scarred, yes, but still breathing, still walking through markets, still praying. Because even when the world turned away, they didn't vanish. They just learned to exist without being seen. And that, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy of all. You've seen the paintings, women draped in fine fabrics, a delicate veil over their hair, sometimes across the forehead, sometimes the mouth, sometimes the entire face. But this wasn't always modesty. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes it was strategy. What do you think a veil hides? In the medieval world, it wasn't just a fashion choice. It was armor. A veil could conceal a healing wound, a fading bruise, or a face deemed less worthy. It could hide shame, society's, not the woman's. Some women wore them after childbirth, if their appearance changed. Others were ordered to wear them after a punishment. In some cases, it was religion, but in others, it was reputation control. A nobleman's wife, if scarred or aged, was expected to veil at court, not for modesty, for the optics, because in these halls of power, a woman's face represented her husband's status. If her beauty faded, his image cracked. Can you imagine being told to hide your face, not because you sinned, but because you aged? The veil became both shelter and prison, and still, women found ways to use it for themselves. In cloistered convents, veils were uniform, but they also gave nuns the rare gift of anonymity. Inside those folds of linen, a woman could be without being judged. For the peasantry, veils were rare. But for those who could sew one from scraps, it was more than protection from wind or dust. It was privacy. In a world where every eye searched a woman's face for beauty or weakness, a veil said, "Look elsewhere." But here's the strange thing. In some regions, especially later in the Middle Ages, veiling beauty itself became a kind of power. The untouched face, the covered brow, the hidden gaze. Men whispered about the woman who never showed her smile. Curiosity turned to desire. Mystery became currency. Isn't that ironic? The very thing once forced on women in shame was now used to command attention. Because in the end, visibility was the battlefield. Too visible, you risk shame. Too hidden, you risk erasure. Somewhere in between, there was power. Have we learned anything since? Today, we unveil not with linen, but with screens. We choose what to post, what to hide, what filter to wear. And still, the question remains. If no one sees you, do you disappear? Or worse, if they see the real you, will they look away? In the medieval world, a veil was safer, but it came with a price. You could protect yourself, but only by accepting invisibility. The mirror lies, but the bottle promises. And in medieval Europe, beauty didn't come from nature. It came from the apothecary's shelf. Small glass vials, ground minerals, pastes stored in bone jars, and handwritten recipes that whispered the impossible. Whiten the skin, erase blemishes, preserve youth. But these weren't harmless powders. They were poisons, and every woman who used them knew it. Would you risk your life to be beautiful? Many did. The most prized complexion in noble courts was pale, deathly pale. Not just a sign of wealth, because only laborers tanned, but of delicacy, femininity, and control. So women mixed vinegar with lead. They created a face paste called Venetian ceruse, made from white lead, distilled and dried. It burned, it stung, it cracked the skin, but it created a ghostly, flawless surface. For a while, Each application smoothed the skin. Each removal tore it apart. But they kept using it because beauty wasn't just vanity. It was survival. Have you ever done something that hurt just to fit in? Then you understand. The powders also contained arsenic, believed to lift the tone. And mercury? It was used to dissolve facial hair. Women rubbed their faces raw, breathed in toxins, absorbed death through their pores day after day. And slowly, the symptoms appeared: the trembling hands, the bleeding gums, the hallucinations, the peeling skin, which only demanded more makeup to cover it. Some went mad, some miscarried, some died. But the worst part, no one warned them, because even the doctors, many of whom were men, supported these treatments. A disfigured woman was pitiable. But a beautiful corpse? That was still art. What does that tell you about the world they lived in? Even queens weren't safe. Historical records suggest that Elizabeth I of England, centuries later, relied heavily on ceruse after surviving smallpox. Her face scarred, so she painted it white, layer upon layer, until her skin became an armor of silence. But the tradition goes deeper, older. In France, in Italy, even among wealthy Muslim women in Moorish Spain, cosmetic manuals were passed like sacred texts. Boil this root, crush this pearl, apply with a silver spoon. All whispered the same lie: you can become beautiful if you suffer enough. Are we so different today? How many products do we buy, hoping to fix a face that was never broken? How many rituals do we inherit, not knowing they were born from desperation? In medieval times, the beauty recipe wasn't just skin deep. It was a spell, a promise, a curse. And the women who followed it weren't foolish. They were trying to survive a world that gave them no value unless they glowed. Even if the glow came from poison, step into a medieval court, not with your ears, but with your eyes. Silks rustle, jewels catch the torchlight, painted faces smile without warmth, and everywhere eyes are watching. Dozens, hundreds. But none of them look at the king. They're watching his wife, his daughter, his mistress. Because in the royal court, a woman's beauty wasn't hers to own. It was property, a symbol of prestige, wealth, fertility, and power. And once you stepped into that chamber, your body belonged to the gaze. Imagine this. You're a young noblewoman at court. You've spent hours tightening your bodice, whitening your face, perfecting your hair into tight, elegant braids. You speak little, because cleverness might be taken as insolence. You smile politely, because to scowl is political suicide. And you pretend not to notice that every nobleman in the hall is assessing you, not for love, for value. Because beauty in court was a commodity, to be traded, flaunted, compared. And it was fragile. One bad day, one scar, one moment too bold, and your social standing could collapse. Have you ever felt like a product on display? That was the court, a marketplace of faces. And it wasn't just the men doing the judging. Older women whispered about younger ones. Rivals spread rumors of false teeth, dyed hair, or worse, cosmetic alchemy. Some even accused others of witchcraft if their beauty seemed unnatural. Because to be too beautiful was dangerous, and to lose beauty was a scandal. In some courts, portraits were commissioned not for memory, but for propaganda. A woman's face became a nation's front page. Smooth skin, that meant the realm was stable. Bright eyes, that meant the dynasty had hope. A flaw in the portrait, a crack in the kingdom. So artists lied, and women disappeared behind the paint. Even queens, the highest women in the land, were not spared. Their beauty was the proof of their husband's power. Their fertility was the future of a crown. And if they failed, they were quietly replaced, sent to distant estates, forgotten. Why is it that women are punished for time when time touches all of us? In the medieval court, a woman's beauty didn't belong to her. It belonged to her family, to her husband, to her country, to history. And when the court moved on, when eyes turned toward the next face, her story ended, at least in public. But in private, she still breathed, still aged, still remembered the girl she once was, a girl whose face was never hers to keep. She walked into the chapel late, every head turned, not because she was noble, not because she was loud, but because she was beautiful, too beautiful, and that made her dangerous. In medieval Europe, beauty could open doors, but it could also get you burned, not metaphorically, literally, because when a woman's beauty was too perfect, too untouchable, too adored, someone always wanted to destroy it. Sometimes it was a rival, a scorned noblewoman watching her lover's eyes stray, a merchant's daughter watching her betrothal fall apart. Whispers spread like fire. She uses herbs to keep her skin young. She bathes alone at night, speaking charms. She doesn't age. It's not natural. Soon, that whisper became accusation. She's a witch. How easy it was to turn admiration into fear. A scratch on a door, a stillbirth in the village, a failed harvest. Blame the beautiful woman. And so she stood trial, not for crime, but for appearance. And the punishments? They were crafted to match the envy. Some were branded on the face, right at the cheekbone. Others had their hair, their pride, shaved off in the center of town. A few were forced to drink scalding liquids to purify their corrupted beauty. And yes, some were burned, their faces gone, their names erased. Ask yourself, what kind of society sees beauty as a threat? The truth is, the line between praise and punishment was razor thin. Even within families, envy could fester. Historical records speak of noble sisters sabotaging each other, mixing lye into face creams, boiling vinegar too long so it would scar instead of soften. Some used crushed beetles, pretending it was rouge, knowing it would leave burns under candlelight. It wasn't just nobles, even peasant girls were targets. A farmhand's daughter, prettier than the rest. Suddenly, she's blamed for the neighbor's dying crops. And then, she's gone. Why? Because beauty wasn't seen as something divine. It was suspicious. It disrupted the order. It stirred desire in husbands. It sowed discord among wives. It made men jealous of each other. So who really suffered when a woman was beautiful? Not just her, but anyone who loved her. Because in the medieval mind, no one was that perfect without help. And if the help wasn't godly, it must have been devilish. Burn her, mark her, silence her, let her face rot, so no man would ever want her again. And the tragedy? It worked. She walked into the chapel late. Every head turned. Not because she was noble, not because she was loud, but because she was beautiful, too beautiful. And that made her dangerous. In medieval Europe, beauty could open doors, but it could also get you burned. Not metaphorically, literally. Because when a woman's beauty was too perfect, too untouchable, too adored, someone always wanted to destroy it. Sometimes it was a rival, a scorned noblewoman watching her lover's eyes stray, a merchant's daughter watching her betrothal fall apart. Whispers spread like fire. She uses herbs to keep her skin young. She bathes alone at night, speaking charms. She doesn't age, it's not natural. Soon, that whisper became accusation. She's a witch. How easy it was to turn admiration into fear. A scratch on a door, a stillbirth in the village, a failed harvest. Blame the beautiful woman. And so she stood trial, not for crime, but for appearance. And the punishments? They were crafted to match the envy. Some were branded on the face, right at the cheekbone. Others had their hair, their pride, shaved off in the center of town. A few were forced to drink scalding liquids to purify their corrupted beauty. And yes, some were burned, their faces gone, their names erased. Ask yourself, what kind of society sees beauty as a threat? The truth is, the line between praise and punishment was razor thin. Even within families, envy could fester. Historical records speak of noble sisters sabotaging each other, mixing lye into face creams, boiling vinegar too long so it would scar instead of soften. Some used crushed beetles, pretending it was rouge, knowing it would leave burns under candlelight. It wasn't just nobles, even peasant girls were targets. A farmhand's daughter, prettier than the rest. Suddenly, she's blamed for the neighbor's dying crops. And then, she's gone. Why? Because beauty wasn't seen as something divine. It was suspicious. It disrupted the order. It stirred desire in husbands. It sowed discord among wives. It made men jealous of each other. So who really suffered when a woman was beautiful? Not just her, but anyone who loved her. Because in the medieval mind, no one was that perfect without help. And if the help wasn't godly, it must have been devilish. Burn her, mark her, silence her, let her face rot, so no man would ever want her again. And the tragedy? It worked. Close your eyes. Now imagine the sound of metal scraping bone. A heated rod pressed gently, ever so gently, beneath the cheek. Steam rising from skin. A scream swallowed behind clenched teeth. Now open your eyes. Because this is not a dungeon. This is a boudoir. What would you endure to be beautiful? In the medieval world, beauty was pain, not in metaphor, but in practice. And the tools, they would not look out of place in a torturer's kit. Hot irons were used to curl hair, often without any guards or protective wax. One slip, and the scalp burned raw. Bone tools sharpened to a point were used to shape eyebrows, to press the eyelids, to smooth the folds beneath the eyes. But bone cracks. And when it did, it cut. Face clamps, yes, real ones, were sometimes used by wealthier women to reshape their features while they slept. They believed pressure could narrow a nose, elevate a cheek, correct a jawline. The pain wasn't accidental. It was a currency. To suffer for beauty proved you deserved it. Isn't that still true in some ways? If it didn't hurt, they thought it wasn't working. Take the cosmetic masks, for instance. Made of linen, soaked in vinegar, egg whites, mercury, or crushed snails. Applied overnight. By morning, the skin often blistered or flaked, revealing a pink glow beneath. That glow, it was inflammation, but they called it radiance, and they kept doing it. Tooth files were used by the elite to shave teeth into more even rows, not by dentists, by servants, with blades meant for parchment. Some women applied hot oil to their lips to make them swell. Full lips were a mark of youth. The oil came from poppies, sometimes nettles, sometimes chili paste. And if it got into the eyes, blindness. But still, they did it, because every scar hidden under makeup was a step closer to marriage, to survival, to power. Would you risk disfigurement to avoid starvation? For many women, this wasn't vanity. It was strategy. To be chosen, to be protected, to have a roof, food, or status. They weren't fools. They were fighters in a war where the weapon was your own face. So they endured the iron, the boiling wax, the stinging salves, the poisoned powders. And when it went wrong, they simply vanished from the records. No paintings, no names, just forgotten. Because no one wanted to remember the girl who failed at being beautiful. She was praised as the most beautiful woman in all of France. Golden hair like woven sunlight. A face so symmetrical that poets wrote sonnets before ever seeing her. Skin as pale as ivory, flawless, soft, and cold. Her name was Isabeau of Bavaria, and for a time she wore a crown. But beneath the silks, beneath the songs, was a woman drowning in a world that punished beauty the moment it lost control. Have you ever been admired only to be hated for it? That was Isabeau's story. Married at just 15 to King Charles VI of France, her beauty was not a gift, it was politics. Her face became a flag. Her womb, a national investment. She was expected to be gentle, fertile, obedient, and endlessly perfect. For a time, she fulfilled those roles. Lavish ceremonies, royal airs, a court that celebrated her elegance. But then, the king began to change. Charles VI fell into madness. Episodes where he could not recognize his own wife, or violently attacked his servants. He would wander the halls howling, or collapse in fits of screaming. The crown grew unstable. And who did they blame? Her. Not the doctors, not the politics, not the family feuds. Her beauty became suspect, her presence too powerful. Whispers turned into accusations. She bewitched him, they said. She uses potions. She is no queen, she is a curse. And so, her very appearance, once her greatest weapon, became her death sentence in slow motion. Why is it that when women rise, the world searches for ways to pull them down? Isabeau was suddenly unwelcome in her own court. Pamphlets mocked her. Nobles called her fat, extravagant, cold. Chroniclers painted her as greedy, manipulative, even treasonous. They called her a modern Helen of Troy, as if her face alone had brought a kingdom to ruin. And yet, she stayed. She navigated alliances, shielded her children, tried to preserve the throne for her son, the future Charles VII. But history was already being rewritten. Isabeau's portraits were altered to make her look severe. Poems once praising her beauty were burned. And soon, even the facts blurred. Some said she'd slept with her brother-in-law. Others claimed she plotted against her own husband. None of it was proven. But it didn't matter. Once a woman is declared a villain, who bothers to ask the truth? By the time Isabeau died in 1435, she was already a shadow. No monuments, no grand tomb, no defense in the pages of official history. Her beauty had brought her power, then suspicion, then ruin. A curse not of her making, but one written onto her face by the world around her. They dressed her body with care, laid fresh petals across her chest, smoothed wax over her lips to keep them soft, rouged her cheeks with crushed berries. She would go into the grave as she had lived, beautiful. But what does it mean when even in death, a woman's worth is measured by her looks? In medieval Europe, beauty was never just for the living. It followed women to the very end, sculpted, painted, preserved, as if to prove that they had once deserved love, grace, or salvation. Even the poorest families scraped together coins to buy powders for their daughters' final days. A blush to fight the gray, a ribbon to hide the bruises of childbirth, a veil to soften the face stiffened by fever. Because no one wanted to bury a girl who looked frightening, or worse, complain. And ask yourself, why were women denied the dignity of looking like themselves in death? For the noble women, the pressure was even more grotesque. Death portraits were common among elites, painted after the body was prepared, not always accurately. Wrinkles were erased, jaws were corrected, scars mysteriously gone. Sometimes the portrait looked nothing like the woman at all, but no one cared, because the final image had a job: to make her beautiful enough to be remembered. Sometimes wax masks were molded and placed over disfigured faces. Even in caskets, appearance mattered. One noble woman, Lady Mariette of Burgundy, died in a fire. Her face was gone, burned to the bone. But her family placed a sculpted mask over the ruin and dressed her as if she were asleep. No one spoke of the smell or the truth. They just called her elegant. Why did they need her to look perfect, even in death? Because beauty wasn't vanity, it was virtue. A beautiful corpse was proof that the soul had been clean, that the woman had been good, that heaven would receive her. Ugly death, rotting, twisted, bare, that was for sinners. And so the pressure to appear serene, soft, glowing, never ended. It followed women to the grave, even after the suffering, even after the burning, even after the poison or childbirth or plague. Beauty had to win, even if it was made of lies, even if it was painted onto a lifeless face, even if the girl underneath never wanted it in the first place. Think of that. Think of a world so obsessed with appearances that it couldn't let a woman be real, even when she was dead. There are graves without names, tombs tucked in ruined chapels, bones under crumbling stone, no epitaph, no marker, no memory. But once, they were admired. Once, they were the most beautiful women in the room. What happens to beauty when no one remembers the face? In medieval towns across Europe, cemeteries filled with women who lived by the mirror and died by it. And yet, their legacies? Silent. We know the names of kings. We remember the generals, the monks, the scholars. But the women, the ones who were once painted, perfumed, praised, are often buried beneath anonymity. Why? Because beauty, in the end, was not a shield. It was a burden that vanished with age, illness, or disgrace. One noble woman, praised for her radiant skin, died of smallpox at 28. Her family sealed her body in a lead coffin and refused to speak her name again. Too ugly, they said. Too ruined. Too sad. Another, a merchant's wife, known for her gold-threaded hair, was buried in a pauper's pit after her husband lost his fortune. The priest who performed her last rites wrote only, "She had once been pleasant to look at." That was her legacy. Is a woman nothing more than the face she leaves behind? Archaeologists today uncover skeletons with strange deformities, jawbones melted from lead-based cosmetics, skulls shaved by bone-altering devices, teeth filed unnaturally flat. The remains of suffering once mistaken for style. Some graves still hold makeup pots, now cracked, tiny mirrors, beaded combs. Even in burial, their tools were tucked beside them, as if they'd need them in the afterlife. And maybe they believed they would, because for some, heaven was not pearly gates or choirs. Heaven was a face without blemish, a body without age, a gaze that never turned away in disgust. Can you blame them? In a world that punished women for every wrinkle, every pound, every imperfection, what choice did they have but to carry their beauty into death? And yet, none of it saved them. Their graves are weathered, their portraits faded, their stories erased, rewritten, ignored, or never told at all. Where are their monuments? Where are the statues of the girls who bled for elegance? Who burned their skin just to be seen? Who were told their only worth was how they looked, and when they believed it, were discarded? They are ash now, powder in the soil, forgotten, not for lack of beauty, but because that was all they were allowed to be. And beauty doesn't last. She knelt before the altar, the candlelight flickering across her face. She had powdered her skin with chalk dust, drawn a faint line of soot along her lashes. A sinner, yes, but a beautiful one. The priest looked down at her, and for a moment, he hesitated. Why did the church fear beauty in women, yet surround itself with it? Throughout the Middle Ages, the church wielded power not just over sin and salvation, but over the very image of the body. And for women, especially, that power became a prison. On the one hand, Christian texts praised holy beauty. The Virgin Mary was described as radiant, modest, perfect. Saints were often imagined as glowing, untouched maidens. Heaven itself was a place of shining faces and gleaming robes. So women were told to be good was to be beautiful. But at the same time, beauty was dangerous, temptation, vanity, a trap. Preachers warned that women's bodies were gateways to sin, that a well-painted face was a devil's tool, that long hair, red lips, sweet perfume, all were signs of pride, of lust, of damnation. And yet, the same church that condemned beauty also obsessed over it. Saintly relics were kept in jeweled cases. Statues of female martyrs were carved with flowing hair, soft skin, delicate features, even when they died gruesome deaths. It was contradiction at its purest. So what did this do to real women? It forced them into a spiritual trap. Be plain, and you were pious, but ignored. Be beautiful, and you were praised, then condemned. Some tried to walk the line, wearing simple gowns but still whitening their faces, avoiding jewelry, but using rose water behind closed doors. Others went to extremes. There are stories of girls disfiguring themselves, cutting their cheeks, shaving their heads, just to avoid being married off or assaulted. They were applauded by the church for preserving their souls. But ask yourself, is that salvation or submission? One nun wrote in the 14th century, "I scrape the color from my lips each morning, for it is not mine to wear. But I mourn the girl I once saw in the mirror. She is lost now, beneath linen and silence." Even within convents, where beauty was supposed to fade, jealousy, longing, and guilt lingered. They could not escape the world's judgment, nor God's. And so women lived in fear, not just of damnation, but of desire. Not just of male violence, but of their own reflection. A reflection they were told to hate, and then punished for not having. She had no portraits, no letters, no books to remember her. Only one thing remained, a shard of polished copper found in the corner of a collapsed medieval house. On its back, scratched faintly with a knife, were 3 words: "Am I enough?" That question echoed through every burned cheek, every scabbed forehead, every infected lip in medieval Europe. It was the price of perfection, paid in silence. Women throughout the Middle Ages sacrificed more than comfort to chase beauty. They gave up health, freedom, sometimes life itself. They smeared mercury on freckles to bleach them. They soaked their faces in vinegar to tighten the skin. They blistered their eyelids with herbal pastes just to redden them, a sign of innocence and femininity. And if it hurt, they endured it. Because a woman who flinched, who complained, who stopped halfway, she was weak. She was unattractive. What does it do to a society when pain becomes part of being desirable? Consider the case of Lady Elise of Calais. Historical records show her court physician noted severe facial swelling, peeling skin, and constant coughing. She had been applying a beauty tonic daily, a blend of lead powder, vinegar, and crushed pearl. By age 24, her gums bled every morning. By 26, she could no longer smile without bleeding. She died at 28. Her husband had commissioned a painting before her death, a soft, glowing portrait of a healthy woman, untouched by time. That painting hung in the hall. Her real face was never seen again. Is that what perfection means? To be remembered not as you are, but as someone else wished you to be. And it wasn't just the nobles. Peasant girls used ash to darken their lashes. They rubbed dock leaves into their skin to mimic paleness, unaware it could cause rashes and even blindness. Even children were taught to look proper. Some mothers tied tiny corsets onto their daughters at age 5, pressed their noses to be straighter, pinched their cheeks to make them rosy. It was care, they said. It was love. But love that demanded pain is not love. It is control. And who profited from it all? The merchants who sold powders made of poison, the physicians who promised miracle cures, the husbands who displayed their wives like ornaments, the church, the courts, the painters, the poets, all part of the same machine, all benefiting from the suffering they encouraged. And the women, they left no protests, no manifestos, just scars, scratches, fragments of mirrors hidden beneath floorboards. A history not written. A cracked mirror lies buried beneath centuries of dust. Its silver backing has flaked away, its frame rotted, but still, it reflects. Not clearly, not cleanly, but enough to see what once stared into it. A girl, a mother, a noble woman, a peasant's daughter, one of millions. She leaned close each morning, checking her face by candlelight. Was her skin pale enough? Were the bruises hidden? Were the burns healing? Who taught her that her worth depended on this reflection? The mirror never lied, but the world around her did. It told her she was almost beautiful, that with one more powder, one more oil, one more hour of pain, she could finally be accepted, finally be safe, finally be enough. But it was never enough. Every year brought new demands, sharper cheekbones, thinner wrists, whiter skin, less laughter, more obedience. The standards changed, but the punishment never did. Some stopped looking in mirrors altogether. Others stared too long, hoping to find the flaw before someone else pointed it out. And when their faces cracked, when the damage could no longer be hidden, they vanished. How many women disappeared beneath layers of makeup, behind veils, into convents, just to escape being judged? History doesn't remember their names, but we see their legacy in what's been left behind. Clay pots filled with mercury dust, skin-lightening recipes written in the margins of prayer books, medical records that list woman 19, sores from tincture, skeletal remains bearing signs of lead poisoning, jaw erosion, permanent infection. Each one a real life, each one a real tragedy, and none of them fictional. This is not myth. This is not metaphor. This is what really happened. And perhaps the most tragic part? It still does. Have we truly left this behind? We no longer crush pearls to bleach freckles, but we inject poison to freeze wrinkles. We no longer rub vinegar on our faces, but we starve ourselves in the name of a perfect jawline. We burn less with fire and more with chemicals. We no longer whisper through church pews. But we scroll through screens that sell the same lie. You're not enough, but you could be, if you just suffer a little more. And the mirror, it still reflects, still silent, still waiting, not to judge, but to witness. So tonight, when you wash your face, when you look into the glass, ask yourself, who taught you what beauty was? And what did it cost to believe them? Because history remembers the kings, the wars, the dates carved into stone. But what about the girls who were never carved at all? They were beautiful, they were burned, they were buried. And now, finally, they are seen.